This is Peter Kent. As a broadcast journalist, giving voice to pictures was my job. Giving voice to data is my new job. Welcome to the Monthly with Government Analytics.
Welcome to the Monthly. With Canada and the world's post-COVID economies gripped in ever more turbulent economic crisis, too much money, too much demand, too much inflation, too much slack in productivity, Vladimir Putin's barbaric war on Ukraine has inflamed supply and demand incongruities and further threatens global economic growth. Our guest today, Bill Browder, once the largest foreign investor in post-Soviet Russia, the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management, and since the arrest, torture, and murder of his tax lawyer and auditor Sergei Magnitsky in 2009, Bill has championed legislation in Sergei's name in countries around the world. It was passed into law in Canada in 2017. Global economic crisis exacerbated by a cruel, narcissistic warmonger. Bill, welcome to the Monthly, and congratulations on your second runaway bestseller in the tragic Magnitsky saga, Freezing Order, which builds on the original revelations in Red Notice. Welcome.
It's great to see you and great to be here. Thank you.
And in my humble opinion, if I may, Bill, Freezing Order should be mandatory reading for governments, bureaucrats, bankers, and security agencies around the world. But before we examine your relentless campaign to stop Putin, as a fund manager, can you remember a time when there was so much economic volatility in the world?
Well, I think that we're in a world of not just economic volatility, but also political volatility. So I got my first taste of economic dislocation when Russia defaulted in 1998 on their domestic debt. And the Russian, so they defaulted, their domestic bonds went down 90%. The currency went down 75%, and the Russian stock market went down 90%. And then as a result of that, it sent ripples all around the world. And there was the long-term capital management debacle, which set banks running for the hills and so on and so forth. And so that was my first real economic crisis. And that was pretty hard because I was right in the middle of it. And then the second one was 2008, global financial crisis. And there's not anybody who was alive then remembers that very vividly. And I would argue that crisis created a trajectory of economic dislocation where small number of people became very rich, and most people ended up getting a lot poorer in real terms. So you might have the same salary, but everything was a lot more expensive. And I believe that as a result of that, we've seen all sorts of populists and autocrats emerging around the world. Bolsonaro in Brazil, Erdogan in Turkey, Duterte in the Philippines, Putin in Russia, Donald Trump in America. And that type of political dislocation has led to all sorts of things that we're just starting to see for ourselves now. You know, where Hungary is run by almost a dictator who's disabling all sorts of foreign policy in the European Union, and Erdogan is, providing Putin with a way out of sanctions evasion. And it looks to me like this dislocation that we're now in, which is sort of the COVID economic dislocation and the inflation that's coming as a result of all the money printing and loans and so on that came on the back of COVID, plus Putin's gas war with the world, we're going to see even more economic disparity, and that's going to create even more populism and strange political outcomes in different countries. And so I'm particularly pessimistic about the future of the world right now, based on all the things that are brewing in all different places at the moment.
Now, the good news amidst all of this bad is that 7 months after Vladimir Putin embarked on what he thought would be a walkover victory against Ukraine, Russian invasion forces are retreating, in some cases running from Ukrainian troops. What's your assessment of where we are in the war today?
Well, since everybody assumed at the beginning of the war that Russia was going to win in 3 days, that didn't happen. And then everybody assumed that Russia would win a war of attrition by just slowly grinding the Ukrainians down. And that hasn't happened. And now all of a sudden, instead of being stuck in a stalemate, Ukraine has regained some territory. That's a major change in perception. And it's remarkable. I mean, all the best intelligence analysts in the world had no way of predicting any of these things. And so I think Ukraine is always surprising us on the upside in terms of their ability and their willingness to fight a much more treacherous enemy. I mean, Russia outmans and outguns them probably 10 to 1. But we need to be a little bit careful, because we were all so pessimistic that this outcome is so different than our most pessimistic scenarios, that we're saying, my God, this is amazing. And look at all the, the Russian troops running as fast as they can away. It's a tiny part of the whole equation. I mean, I think it's a lot less than 10% of the territory that was previously claimed by the Russians has been freed. 150,000 Ukrainians have been freed from occupation. There's a lot more that the Russians still have. And so I think, first of all, we have to be careful not to become too excited by this, because Putin is a guy who doesn't do humiliation well. And even if it's not everything, even if it's a small piece of the territory they took, it's humiliating. And Putin is a guy who will then double, triple, quadruple down in order to make his point. And so I think we should brace ourselves for what his retaliation is going to be. And we've started to even see pieces of it. They knocked out electricity, and I believe in Kharkiv. They bombed a dam, so all sorts of water is flowing towards Kherson. They're going to be doing a lot of what I guess I would call asymmetric warfare. The Ukrainians aren't allowed by the Allies to really, to attack Russians in Russia. And they're not really allowed to play dirty, which is what the Russians are doing. And so the Ukrainians have been, within the very tightly defined rules of conduct, have been doing an amazing job. But the Russians have stepped so far out of these rules of conduct, it creates a kind of an untenable situation. Because what do the Ukrainians do if the Russians keep on attacking civilian population, civilian infrastructure, et cetera? How do you retaliate against that without losing the moral authority?
So with the war being far from over, Ukrainians still suffering in the battle zone, certainly, and potentially elsewhere in the so-called safe areas now, depending on what Putin does. And I agree, he's capable of doing anything. Europeans at the same time, and people around the world, are facing a bleak winter, energy deficient, and with brutal cost of living increases. So until this is over, would you agree that one of the biggest questions, one of the biggest challenges has to be, will the Western allies stay firm, united against Russia, in support of Ukraine, and in favor of tightening sanctions against Russia?
That is the crucial question, because Ukraine can win this war if they have Western support, and they will lose this war if they don't have Western support. It's just as simple as that. And so, so the key is, and Putin is thinking, he's thinking, maybe I can't win on the battlefield, but I can raise gas prices so high and make life so unpleasant for everybody that all sorts of pragmatist governments, and governments that are being challenged by populist opposition parties and so on, may find themselves having to capitulate. Now, there's a couple of good arguments for why that's not going to happen in the short term. First is that Ukraine has shown that this support leads to outcomes, to positive outcomes, unexpectedly positive outcomes. And I think that in addition to these recent wins helping the Ukrainians with their morale, it's also helped the Europeans with their morale. And so I think that in the short term, anyways, nobody's going to be saying, okay, we need to withdraw our support for Ukraine. It's a good investment. You give money to the Ukrainians, you give equipment to the Ukrainians, they use it very effectively. That's a good outcome. The second thing I would say, and this is based on my own experience in Europe, I've spent the last more than decade working with the European Union, trying to get a European Magnitsky Act in place. And it's taken longer than any place. So US passed the Magnitsky Act in 2012, Canada did in 2017. It took until 2020 for the European Union to have a Magnitsky Act. Why so long? Because they have the most dysfunctional decision-making process. So imagine, you're a Canadian politician. It takes, it's hard enough to deal with one country. Imagine 27 countries all getting involved and having the right to veto each other and all this kind of stuff. It's just completely, so in theory, let's just say that everybody wanted to capitulate right this minute in Europe. For them to actually get together, come up with like a proper consensus on how to capitulate, and then capitulate, we've already made it through the cold winter. And so I think that it's going to be very, if Putin thought that that everyone's just going to roll over and immediately say, okay, no more sanctions, that's just not going to happen, even if they wanted to do that, because that's just not how the Europeans make decisions. It just takes forever for anything to happen. And so, and by the time we've made it through the winter, everyone will have figured out alternatives, and maybe in Germany, they're going to have to turn the thermostat down 3 degrees, and they're going to come up with huge German efficiency to build LNG terminals and finding other sources of gas. And so, I think very clearly the big loser from all this stuff is Russia. Putin thinks, yeah, I can take 10 times as much pain as the Europeans because I'm not a popularly elected leader. But he made a big miscalculation here because even popularly elected leaders can't make decisions in this totally dysfunctional decision-making body. And by the way, the gas that he's not selling to Europe, this Nord Stream 1 pipeline gas, that makes up 25% of the Russian government budget. He's basically cutting his revenues by 25% just with this one action. If you'd ask me, what's the single most important sanction that we can impose on Russia, it would be Europeans stopping buying Russian gas. And if you'd asked me, could we get the Europeans to do that? I would have said, it's impossible. These people are, there's just too much self-interest and economic, aversion to that. But Putin has done it for us.
Now, to freezing order, wherein you lay out in great detail the financial criminality of Putin's oligarchical mob. Until you launched your campaign to honor Sergei Magnitsky and prove that the theft he uncovered, Putin's incredibly complex means of moving billions of criminally acquired dollars to safe havens outside of Russia seemed untrackable. You cracked it with the help of an NGO, a European NGO that investigates organized crime and corruption, the Moldavan bank wire transfers. And you hit on a little known feature of the international banking system that tracks the movement of every US dollar transferred anywhere in the world, even between 2 Russian banks. Was that your eureka moment?
Well, I think I've had a few eureka moments. So first of all, money laundering investigations are extremely complex to do because the money launderers try to make them complex. The more layers, the more countries, the more accounts, the more banks, the harder it is to track. And however, what's interesting is that money laundering doesn't really exist as it's described. There's no way of, back in the old days, if you were a criminal, you could deposit money into one Swiss bank, withdraw it in cash, walk it across the street, deposit it in another bank with another name, another thing, and that would be true money laundering. Nobody would know the source of the money that went into the next bank. Now you can't do that. You can't take out more than $10,000 out of a bank without all sorts of red flags. And so the way that these guys do it is just to move it around so many times, they think that nobody's going to have the patience or the wherewithal to trace it, but it always leaves an indelible trail. And so when we started to investigate the money laundering connected to the murder of Sergei Magnitsky, we started getting little leads, as you mentioned. From one of them was from the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, and they gave us a Moldovan bank cache, which allowed us to trace all the money that went through this key Moldovan money laundering bank. We've also had a whistleblower from Russia, who was a member of the criminal group who turned against his colleagues and provided us with some interesting wire transfer instructions, which alerted us to which companies and which banks were involved that we could then search on. And then we also, as you mentioned, every dollar goes through New York for a second. And we did a subpoena of, we subpoenaed a bunch of New York banks for their bank records of Russian transfers. And they gave us like, millions of transactions. And so I start adding up all these things and you start laying it out on a piece of paper. And eventually, I don't think there is a eureka moment in this situation. You have this, it's like a 7-year process, but eventually it's more like over a very long period of time, like back in the old days when you would take a picture with a digital camera, it would start to, the image would start to crystallize. And that's kind of how this money laundering investigation works. Eventually you get to see really clearly where the money went.
Now, the Canadian House of Commons voted unanimously, finally, as you said, in 2017 to pass our Magnitsky Act. You say in freezing order that it wasn't that the Russians bought villas in Toronto or kept their money in Montreal banks, but rather that other countries would follow Canada's lead. What did you mean by that?
So as I mentioned, we got the original Magnitsky Act passed in 2012, United States. The United States is very powerful. You get on the US sanctions list, it has all sorts of knock-on effects all over the world. But that doesn't mean that people can't find ways of going to other countries and keeping their money. And so you have to have a lot of countries, not just the United States. And however, when I went around the world looking for other countries to pass Magnitsky Acts, I discovered that there's a lot of anti-American sentiment in certain places. Certainly people didn't want to seem to be copying America. But what was interesting is that, as I said, okay, where should I focus my efforts on? Which country should I focus my efforts on where it's going to be, where that has a sort of certain moral authority, and it's also sort of popular. And there's no such thing as being anti-Canadian. Everybody sort of, Canada may not be a big country, but it's considered to be by everybody a very reasonable country. Canadians are like nice, reasonable people. They're not nationalistic. They're not bombastic. And so I thought to myself, if we could get Canada to pass a Magnitsky Act, nobody's gonna, that's a really good precedent that nobody can like sniff at. And so I worked really hard on getting a Canadian Magnitsky Act passed, and you and I met in that process. And I probably made, over the course of 6 years, I probably made like 20 trips to Ottawa. Mm-hmm. And we got it passed in 2017. And it was a very moving moment for me when it was passed. I wasn't actually in Ottawa at the time, but I was watching Parliament TV or whatever you call it over there. And everybody has, well, this, but perhaps people watching this don't, everyone votes in the Canadian Parliament by standing up when one person stands up, that's how they count the votes. And so it was like almost like a human wave. Who's in favor of the Magnitsky Act? One after another was standing up. And then they said, who's opposed? And the whole Parliament sat. And it was really, I was just truly blown away by that moment. It was really like something special.
Well, and it was an exciting moment for us and an honor, but we also all know that it's one thing to list sanctions, it's quite another to enforce. And when I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee back in 2016, when we were reviewing our existing sanction laws and considering your proposals for the Magnitsky Act, we heard abundant evidence that Canadian monitoring and enforcement of listed individuals and companies was dysfunctional because of low prioritization, because of limited capacity to investigate by the RCMP, for example, and because of siloed data in different government departments and agencies. I'd like you here to expand on a point you made in a recent podcast interview with Senator Wallin. I'm pleased to occupy now the chair at the monthly that she formerly held. But you reminded the senator and her listeners that you spoon-fed intelligence to the RCMP in 2017 on some of the fraudulent millions that Sergei had identified and which had been moved to Canada, but that information languished.
Well, it's actually a more scandalous story than you can imagine. So whenever we find money from the Magnitsky murder, and we found a lot of it all over the world, we then wrote to the law enforcement authorities of the relevant country and a criminal complaint saying, here's the evidence of the crime and the connection of the money to the murder, and here's the assets bought or the bank accounts where the money has gone to. Please investigate, freeze, and seize these assets. And we've done this all over the world with great success. And so I filed a complaint with the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Patrol, and they passed it to the head of intelligence at the RCMP, and he started to investigate, and he seemed like quite an impressive guy, a real sort of, I would say, seemed to have his act together. And I was invited several times, along with my colleague Vadim Kleiner, to come to Ottawa to meet him and his team at the headquarters of the RCMP. And then one day he gets arrested. The guy gets arrested for espionage. I mean, it's remarkable. And so I didn't know who to call anymore after he was arrested, because he was like held in solitary confinement or whatever. And I didn't know, like, and was the espionage connected to us or something else? Nobody has ever clarified that. But, a year or so after that, my lawyers wrote to the head of the RCMP saying, this case has been dragging on. What are you guys doing? And they wrote back, say, we meant to tell you. We closed the case. We're not doing any investigation anymore.
Well, and so it continues today. A massive investigation into money laundering in the province of British Columbia just concluded in June that all levels of government, all police organizations have failed spectacularly to address the movement of criminal funds. The commissioner of that investigation, Austin Cullen, slammed the asset forfeiture system. He slammed realtors, money service businesses, lawyer trust accounts, and more for enabling billions of dollars of criminal funds to be laundered, invested, hidden in different places in Canada. Are you surprised?
Well, based on my experience, not at all. And I would go further. So one of the big conclusions of my book was that over a 22-year period since Putin came to power, he and about 1,000 other cronies around him have stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state, from the Russian people, $1 trillion. And if you were to look at how much money has ever been seized, prosecuted, identified by law enforcement in any country, let's not focus on Canada for a second. It's in the low ones of billions. So so all the money has, crime pays.
But we do have some good news on the Canadian side of the money laundering ledger. In that late June, Canada's Parliament amended the Magnitsky Act and other sanctions legislation in Bill C-19, which is our budget bill, our annual budget bill. And the most important provision, for me at least, is that the Canadian government has finally moved on its commitment to create a corporate beneficial registry to identify all investors behind numbered companies and shell corporations. But we still have to come back to that enforcement capacity to go after the dirty billions.
Well, indeed, that's the case. And I don't have a lot of confidence that Canada's, it's not like there's some kind of major reform going on, major restructuring going on. The same people that didn't investigate the case you mentioned in British Columbia, didn't investigate the Magnitsky case, are not going to be investigating cases in the future. Canada clearly doesn't have the sort of human resources to do this type of work. And if Canada doesn't do it, they should bring them in from the outside. The trouble is that many other countries don't have them either. I mean, here in the UK, it's actually worse than Canada. At least in Canada, they opened a criminal investigation before they closed it. In the UK, they never even opened a criminal investigation into the Magnitsky, the dirty money from Magnitsky's murder.
Well, then, freezing notice offers the detail of just how you rocked the courts in the United States. How do we get the Russian oligarchs and Chinese triad bosses, the Oyabun, into Canadian courts? Our current House of Commons and Senate committees are big on engaging with subject matter experts like yourself on issues that they deem a priority. So if another House of Commons chair, committee chair, or Minister Freeland were to invite you back to lead a discussion on effective sanctions enforcement in Canada, effective enforcement of the Magnitsky laws, would you be willing to take the time necessary to put together a detailed presentation where you slowly walk them through the necessary steps?
Absolutely. This is one of my big agenda issues for the future, is how do we actually fix this problem? I mean, I've identified it in my book. It's a terrible problem. I know how to fix it because I'm probably one of the few individuals in the world who've been on the other side trying to do the work that a government should do, having done it, and then seeing exactly where governments fall down in their job. I shouldn't have had to spend the last 13 years of my life running a private investigation into money laundering. This is a job of governments. I've taken the job of a government. I've done and done it with very little resources compared to what the governments have. And all this stuff is doable. I've done it. Governments should be able to do it. And if the governments were to allocate resources to the kind of thing that I've done, it would be unbelievable, the successes that are possible. And where there are structural problems, they can be fixed with legislation. For example, a lot of prosecutors in different countries say, well, we don't want to take this case because we have to prove that a crime was committed in Russia. And to do that, we need Russian government to cooperate with us. Well, you can change that around, as has been done in a number of countries, to say that if money is suspicious, then it needs to be the holder of that money needs to prove it's legitimate. So reverse the burden of proof. That's what they've done here in the UK, for example. They call it the unexplained wealth orders. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different legislative things that could be done to tighten up, clean up, and make it easier to do this stuff. Another thing which could be done is to, and the Americans do this and do it very well, which is to allow the government to keep the money that they've frozen. So it's like almost like a bounty. And so all of a sudden there's a huge financial incentive to actually prosecute these cases. Because right now you have these people looking at them and saying, oh God, it's so complicated. And the moment we freeze the money, there'll be lawyers. But if all of a sudden, the government, that department is going to get $50 million, I think the whole, even though the individuals aren't getting rich, the whole equation changes. And so there's ways of changing the incentives, changing the risk reward, changing the complexity. All these things can be done, but you need to understand that this is probably one of the most important failings of every government. Putin has been doing this stuff for a long time, getting away with it. And I believe one of the reasons that he's at war and we're, in this terrible situation is because he's trying to stay in power after stealing so much money, because he's worried about his people rising up. And so everything is connected to money.
Right. Well, and to your point about forfeiture, that is another excellent provision in the amendments to the Magnitsky Act passed by the government in June. There is a provision that those monies can be forfeited and assigned to any domestic application, or in the case of the war in Ukraine, to helping rebuild the destruction wrought by criminality. Now, let's talk about some of the prime enablers of criminality and money laundering in the West. Lawyers. US sanctions have been actually applied against American law firms to cease Russian dealings. The British government has sent warnings now to law firms, the notorious libel lawyers, and to banks, public relations, or relations agencies about dealings with the UK's long list of oligarchs and their families and companies. In Canada, some of our big law firms, notably Norton Rose, have cut all ties with their Russian clients, but other Canadian firms with substantial Russian clientele and business dealings are refusing to comment. Do you see any legitimate excuse for law firms in Canada to continue business as usual with Russians, whether sanctioned or not?
No, there's no excuse. It's absolutely unacceptable to be doing business with Russians, given what's happening in Ukraine right now. And anybody who does is effectively a war profiteer. It's very, very clear, and it's very interesting. You mentioned Norton Rose. I remember at the very beginning of this whole Russian invasion, there was some talk about them wanting to stay in the keep doing some business in Russia. And I remember there was some, I can't remember the exact situation, but they wanted to carry on. And I tweeted about it, and it was from Canada. One of the partners said that we at Norton Rose in Canada don't feel that way. And a couple of days later, Norton Rose backed down from whatever their position was. And I was happy to see that, and I was happy to see that, publicly calling out law firms for doing that. The rules that have been put in place by the US government and the British government, and I don't know whether Canada is part of this or not, is that consultants, PR firms, private investigation firms, et cetera, can no longer work for Russian clients. It's just against the rules now. But lawyers still can. And I think that there's absolutely, if everybody is entitled to a legal defense, but doesn't mean a lawyer is required to provide that defense. They could find somebody, somebody else to find, get someone in Russia. But the it's really interesting here in London. They have what they call solicitors and barristers. Solicitors are the guys who prepare the paper. Barristers are the ones who put on the wigs and go into trial. And there's a particular class of barristers called QCs, means Queen's Counsel, and there's only like 1,000 of them in the country. They're like the best of the best. And whenever you challenge them about working for Russian bad guys, they'll say, well, we have something called the taxi rank principle, where if you put your hand out and a taxi has to take you. But it's really interesting because that's how they justify taking the Russian clients. But I've been sued all high, low, in all different ways by the Russian government and their proxies. And I've gone out looking for barristers and QCs. And oftentimes they don't want to take my business because they don't want to ruin their chances to get all this lucrative Russian stuff. And so, these people all have to stop it and just behave like everybody else and stop, in any way profiting off of this terrible war.
Now, Bill, you have been and continue to be literally heroic in your pursuit of Putin's financial thugs and to expose Putin's mob leadership, but you're also the first to speak, to pay tribute to the Russian human rights champions and opposition politicians who have been and are still today persecuted by Putin. Boris Nemtsov, murdered on a Moscow bridge in 2015, Alexander Perepelichny, a whistleblower who was murdered, Andrei Kozlov, head of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation, murdered, Alexei Navalny, who courageously returned himself to Russia after recovering from near fatal poisoning, now sentenced to 9 years on a fabricated fraud charge. And of course, our common friend who testified in Canada many times with you and on his own, Vladimir Karamurza, again, who left his safe home in New Jersey. to return to Russia to resist Putin, and who is now also cruelly jailed, doing hard time, charged with the questionable defense of spreading deliberate false information. And there are so many more.
Yeah, so many more. Let's just talk about Vladimir Kara-Murza for a second, because he's particularly important to me because he's a close friend. He's an ally, and he was one of the most important people I worked with in the Magnitsky justice campaign and getting the Magnitsky Act passed. And as you mentioned, he showed up numerous times in Canada to testify about the necessity of having a Magnitsky Act, how Russian people support sanctioning their kleptocratic leaders with the Magnitsky Act. And Vladimir Kara-Murza became so effective and so well known and so beloved in the West that the Russians tried to kill him with poison as well, twice, once in 2015 and second time in 2017. And as you mentioned, he after the war started, he returned to Moscow. I was with him 3 days before he returned to Moscow here in London. I had dinner with him and his wife and my wife, and I said, my book is coming out in a few weeks. It'd be really great if you could come to the book launch in Washington, because you're a hero in my book, and it'd be just great if you could speak and say a few words. And he said, I wouldn't miss it for the world. I will absolutely be there, but I'm going to Moscow first. And I said, what do you mean you're going to Moscow first? You can't go to Moscow. It's crazy. You know, they've already tried to kill you twice. They'll do, I don't know what they'll do to you. They'll kill you or put you in prison. And he said, but how am I supposed to stand up to the Putin regime and ask people, the Russian people, to stand up to the Putin regime, if I'm too scared to even come to my own country? I wouldn't be a patriot. I wouldn't be a politician. I wouldn't be a leader. I have to go back. And I pleaded with him. I said, well, okay, well, why don't you go back in like 3 months' time? Let's just see where the dust settles. Like, I don't know, don't. And he was absolutely immovable. And he went back, and I watched this on TV. He was on CNN, and he called Putin a murderer on CNN. I was watching it in real time. And an hour later, he was arrested. Mm. And he's been in jail ever since. And it looks like they have 2 different cases going against him. One for being a member of a undesirable organization, 6 years, and another for, quote, spreading false information about the war by calling it a war, not a special military operation, 9 years. So he's facing 15 years in prison. He's already been in jail since about mid-March. So, it's an example of a type of heroism that we don't see very often in our world, where people are ready to sacrifice their freedom and their life for their country. And in our Western political systems, we have so few people ready to do anything, even sacrifice the possibility of losing their position in Congress or in Parliament to stand up to whatever nonsense is going on that they should be disagreeing with. I'm just so amazed, in awe, and scared for Vladimir and others, Alexei Navalny and many others, hundreds, if not thousands of others who are sitting in similar positions right now in Moscow.
Well, we certainly all owe them a debt outside, and so do the Russian people, who many in their own ignorance don't realize what is being done on their behalf by these courageous individuals. A final question, and again, given the magnificent Ukrainian counteroffensive these past couple of weeks, how long can Putin drag out this war? How long can he cling to power? And just important, and we addressed this before, but how long can our democratic alliance against him hold without cracks in that alliance? And I know you addressed the fact that in Europe, at least, the complications of getting the EU to do anything going one way or another, but to keep public opinion is going to begin to rage against inflation and inflation fighting legislation and actions, and the war is one of we're already seeing among some of the Putin trolls on social media trying to arouse people into abandoning support for the war.
Well, I don't know the answer to the how long question, but it's important to put a few things into perspective. This war didn't start on February 24th this year. This war started in 2014. We conveniently in the West, the media and the governments all described the war as like a revolution, Russian-backed separatists. There was a revolution. This was a Russian operation, a Russian invasion of Eastern Ukraine and Crimea. And it's been going on for 8 years before February 14th. I'm sorry, February 24th. There's no reason to think that this thing won't be going on for another 8 years based on, I mean, you know, Putin, I don't see Putin giving up. And I know for sure the Ukrainians aren't going to give up. And as much as I'd like to think the Ukrainians may win, and they may very well win. I mean, nobody expected where they are right now. But I can also say that Putin has got a lot of resources. He's got a ton of money. They're hoovering up convicts right now to go and fight in the fight. They're getting, you know, members of the Syrian, you know, they're hiring Syrians to fight in the Russian fight. North Korea offered them 100,000 troops. This is not going to end. I mean, you know, it's either going to end with a total collapse of Russia, of the Russian military, which I doubt, or it's just going to carry on and carry on and carry on. And then we do get to this really important issue, which is, you know, if the West doesn't support Ukraine, they will cave very quickly, not because of any lack of motivation, but they need financial support and they need military support. And the longer it goes on for, the harder it is to justify that in a world where we're all suffering cost of living crises and so on. And so it's hard to say how it all shakes out. And hopefully the Ukrainians continue on this trajectory where maybe we don't have to wait that long. But I think the most likely scenario is carry on and carry on and carry on. And then we end up with this terrible downside risk of, you know, losing our alliance.
Bill, thank you for your time today, your insight and your counsel. Thanks for all you've done and all you continue to do in pursuit of justice for Sergei and for all of the other honest resisting Russians, living and dead. And thank you for the Magnitsky laws, which are not only aimed at containing Putin, but tyrannical despots anywhere. Thanks to my colleagues at Government Analytics and to all of you joining us today. Until the next edition of the Monthly, that's a wrap. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Giving voice to data is the Monthly with Government Analytics.